In the late 1800s, the small frontier town of Deadwood was a place already known for its rough edges. Gamblers, miners, cowboys, and broken dreams seemed to fill every dusty street. But hidden beneath the noise of saloons and the clang of horseshoes was a story so disturbing that even those hardened by the Wild West hesitated to speak of it. This was not a tale of shootouts, gold mines, or outlaw legends. It was the story of a cowboy whose choices crossed the most forbidden boundaries of family and morality, leaving behind a legacy that would haunt generations. In 1888, whispers began spreading through the isolated ranches outside of town. Neighbors noticed something strange. Children who carried the unmistakable look of sickness, deformities that couldn't easily be explained by poor health or bad luck. The rumors grew louder when people started to realize these children all came from the same ranch, a place where a man ruled with silence, secrecy, and an iron hand. He was a cowboy respected for his work ethic, yet feared for the way he kept his family cut off from the outside world. Few dared to ask questions, but those who did never received honest answers. This is not an easy story to hear. It is a story about what happens when isolation, shame, and abuse collide in the hidden corners of a community that chose to look the other way. It is about the unspeakable truth of a man who fathered children with his own granddaughter, a fact that only came to light after years of suspicion, pain, and tragedy. Tonight, we are going to revisit that story. Not with the intention of sensationalizing it, but to understand how such darkness could grow unchecked in a place where everyone knew each other's names. By the end, you will see not just the shocking truth of one family, but also the way society failed to protect its most vulnerable. Stay with us until the very end, because the revelations are unlike anything you've ever heard. And before we begin, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel, leave a like on this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us from which city you are watching, because even though this story took place in Deadwood, the lessons it carries could belong to any town, anywhere in the world. When you first approached the ranch on the outskirts of Deadwood in 1888, the silence was the first thing you noticed. The town itself was noisy, bars spilling music and laughter, miners shouting over their winnings and losses. But out here, the only sounds were the creak of wooden fences, the faint lowing of cattle, and the sharp whistle of the wind cutting across the prairie. The ranch sat on a slight rise, overlooking a stretch of dry grassland that seemed endless, broken only by crooked fence posts and the dark silhouette of a barn leaning with age. The house itself was modest, built of rough-hewn logs with a thin roof of warped shingles that seemed to bend under the weight of countless winters. The windows were narrow, almost watchful, as though the house itself did not welcome strangers. Smoke rose from the chimney, though faintly, as if the family within burned their wood sparingly. A broken wagon wheel leaned against the side of the porch, and near the barnyard, a rusted plow sat half buried in weeds forgot. Life here was not easy. The soil was rocky, the winters harsh, and the town of Deadwood, though notorious for its gold rush wealth, was still a half-day's ride away. For most families, survival depended on neighbors helping neighbors, but this ranch seemed different. The fences were high, not just for cattle, but for privacy. No children played in the yard. No visitors came down the path. The family lived behind closed doors, tucked away from the rest of the community. When visitors did appear, traveling merchants, ranch hands looking for temporary work, they were met by the same stern figure, the cowboy himself. Broad-shouldered, weathered from years of labor, and always with a revolver tucked at his hip, he carried the air of someone who demanded respect without asking. His words were few, his eyes sharp, and his presence alone seemed enough to discourage questions. Behind him, shadowed in the doorway, stood his granddaughter, a young woman barely grown, her expression caught between obedience and fear. Neighbors had long noticed the absence of other adults on the property. Some whispered that his own children had left years ago, unable to bear his temper. Others suggested they had simply vanished, leaving only the granddaughter to tend to the house and the children who appeared there one by one, never introduced, never explained. The atmosphere around the ranch was heavy, as if every log of the cabin and every fence post carried secrets nailed into them. It was a place where silence was both protection and prison, and where the truth lingered like smoke that refused to clear. For anyone arriving at that ranch, it became clear that behind the quiet walls was a family hiding from the world, and perhaps from itself. At first glance, life on the ranch seemed no different from any other struggling homestead on the Dakota frontier. The chores were endless: feeding cattle, patching fences, hauling water from the well, and the family moved through them with practiced silence. Yet the more time you spent observing, the more unsettling details began to emerge. The children were the first sign. They appeared suddenly, as if out of nowhere, each one bearing the unmistakable features of the cowboy himself: broad foreheads, sharp jaws, and piercing blue eyes that mirrored his own. But alongside those resemblances came troubling differences. Some of the children struggled to walk properly, their legs bowed or twisted. Others spoke with difficulty, their words slurred or delayed. A few bore small deformities, crooked fingers, uneven eyes that the neighbors tried to dismiss as accidents of birth. But the repetition of such traits, all within one family, could not be ignored. Visitors to the ranch often commented quietly afterward about the odd atmosphere inside the house. The walls were bare, stripped of decoration, and the room smelled faintly of kerosene and damp earth. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that made strangers eager to finish their business quickly and leave. The children rarely smiled, and when they did, it was tentative, as if uncertain whether joy was allowed. Their mother, who was, in truth, the cowboy's granddaughter, watched them with eyes that seemed far older than her years, eyes that revealed exhaustion but also a quiet resignation, as though she had long accepted a life with no escape. One merchant who delivered flour and salt recalled how the cowboy never let his granddaughter speak directly to outsiders. If she stepped forward to answer a question, he would cut her off with a sharp glance, and she would shrink back into the shadows. The children, too, seemed rehearsed in silence, their voices small, their movements cautious. It was as if an unspoken rule governed the household. No explanations, no questions, no words that might reveal too much. Whispers among neighbors grew louder. Some speculated about hidden marriages within the family, others about tragedies that had forced them into isolation. But there was always a hesitation to speak openly, because to accuse a man in those days, especially one with a reputation for violence, was to invite danger. Still, every crooked smile, every limp, every scar that couldn't be accounted for pushed people closer to a chilling suspicion that the children were not simply his kin, but his descendants in more ways than one. The pieces were small, scattered, almost deniable when taken alone. But when seen together, the fearful granddaughter, the silent children, the deformities, the guarded fences, they began to form a picture far more disturbing than anyone wanted to believe. Deadwood in 1888 was not the bustling gold town it had once been during the height of the rush. The frenzy that had filled the streets with prospectors and gamblers was fading, and many families who had come seeking fortune were left with little more than broken dreams. For some, this meant leaving the Dakota territory behind in search of opportunity elsewhere. For others, it meant clinging to what land they had, even if it was unforgiving and isolated. The cowboy in question belonged to the second group. He had settled on his ranch years earlier, building his home with his own hands. In his youth, he was admired for his strength and determination, but time hardened him into something else. Neighbors described him as a man who valued control above all else, over his land, his cattle, and his family. His children grew up under that authority, but one by one they disappeared from the household. Some married and moved away. Others were rumored to have fled in anger, unwilling to endure his temper. What remained was his granddaughter, left in his care after her mother, his own daughter, died young under circumstances never fully explained. The community around Deadwood was small and gossip spread fast. Yet the ranch remained a mystery, guarded by silence and distance. In those days, family matters were rarely questioned by outsiders. The law was thin on the frontier, and neighbors often avoided interfering, fearing retaliation, or simply believing it was not their place. Churches spoke of morality on Sundays, but behind closed doors, people turned their heads away from things too uncomfortable to confront. A handful of locals remembered the girl as a child, bright-eyed and shy, trailing after her mother into town for supplies. After her mother's death, however, her visits grew less frequent, until she all but disappeared from sight. By the time she re-emerged, she was no longer a girl but a young woman carrying children of her own. The troubling detail was that no one had ever seen her with a husband nor heard of a marriage. In a town where every union was a topic of discussion, her silence raised quiet alarms. The few records that existed, old church registries, school logs, and census notes, painted an incomplete but telling picture. Her name was often listed in the same household as her grandfather's, without mention of another man. Witnesses noted that the children she bore never had fathers recorded in official documents. It was chalked up to clerical error or the hardship of rural life, but some suspected the truth was darker. In a society where honor and reputation meant survival, such whispers were dangerous. Families guarded their secrets fiercely, especially in small communities where shame could last for generations. And so, the cowboy's household became one of silence, where neighbors chose ignorance over confrontation, and where the weight of suspicion settled heavily but quietly on the edge of town. As months turned into years, the whispers surrounding the ranch grew more persistent. What had once been quiet unease turned into careful observation, and soon the fragments of suspicion began to align in ways that no one could ignore. The children, now older, carried striking resemblances not just to each other, but to the cowboy himself. His sharp cheekbones, the same piercing blue eyes, the same narrow set of the mouth. It was as though each generation was repeating his features, almost like a mirror echoing back at the community. For those who dared to look closer, the similarities were impossible to dismiss. One of the first to raise concern was a local preacher. After a brief visit to deliver food during a harsh winter, he confided to a fellow clergyman that he felt something was profoundly wrong inside that house. He described how the girl, by then a young woman, never met his gaze, how her children hovered near her with a nervousness that seemed unnatural. When he asked simple questions, the cowboy himself interrupted, giving answers clipped and final, as if to shut the matter down. Then came the inconsistencies. A census taker, tasked with recording families in the area, noted that the granddaughter's children were listed without fathers' names. He asked about it and was met with silence, followed by the cowboy's cold stare. The encounter was so unsettling that he left without pressing further. When the official records came back incomplete, no one in town demanded corrections. It was easier to let the gaps remain. Yet, for some, the unease was unbearable. A neighbor whose land bordered the ranch told how she had seen the girl late at night, hanging laundry in the cold, her hands trembling, her face pale in the moonlight. The woman insisted there was fear in her eyes, the kind of fear that comes not from poverty but from captivity. When she hinted at it in town, she was warned to hold her tongue. "That man is dangerous," they told her. "Don't stir up trouble you can't put down." But trouble was already there, growing like a shadow that could no longer be contained. Each piece of testimony, the preacher's unease, the census records, the neighbor's account, added weight to a theory too awful to speak aloud. People began to murmur words they had avoided: incest, coercion, abuse. The idea seemed unthinkable, yet it explained everything. The silence, the secrecy, the children's deformities, the girl's hollow gaze. Still, no one acted. To accuse a man without proof in 1888 was to risk everything: your safety, your standing in the community, even your livelihood. And so, the truth remained in the shadows, unspoken but increasingly undeniable, waiting for the moment when the evidence would no longer be ignored. As suspicions thickened, a few brave voices attempted to confront the silence that hung over the ranch. Yet each attempt was met with resistance so firm it seemed almost insurmountable. The cowboy had spent decades cultivating an image of strength and control, and he wielded it like a weapon. When a local doctor, called out to examine one of the children who had fallen ill, cautiously inquired about the mother's health and family history, the cowboy's reply was sharp and final. "My family is none of your business. Treat the boy or leave." The doctor, sensing danger in the hard set of the man's jaw and the revolver glinting at his side, finished his work quickly and never returned. The granddaughter, meanwhile, remained locked in silence. Whenever townsfolk tried to engage her during rare trips into Deadwood, her words were clipped, her eyes darting to her grandfather as though seeking approval before she spoke. Any time her responses strayed beyond the most ordinary exchanges, the cowboy would step forward, his voice calm but firm, ending the conversation. The effect was chilling. It was as though she was present, but her voice belonged to him. Neighbors, too, found themselves paralyzed. Some admitted privately that they wanted to intervene, but the risk was too great. The cowboy was known to be quick to anger and slow to forgive. He carried his gun openly, and stories circulated of how he had once beaten a ranch hand nearly to death for disrespecting him. To accuse such a man without undeniable proof was to invite violence upon oneself and one's family, and so fear became his greatest ally. Even the law, thin as it was in the Dakota Territory, proved ineffective. The sheriff, aware of the rumors, rode out to the ranch under the pretense of checking livestock brands. He left with nothing but narrowed eyes and a sense of unease. The cowboy had offered no warmth, but also no evidence. Without testimony or hard proof, there was nothing to bring before a judge. Family matters, after all, were often considered private, and the law rarely interfered unless a crime was laid bare in public. For those watching from the outside, it felt as if the truth was trapped behind the log walls of that house, just out of reach. The granddaughter's silence was both shield and prison, the children suffering a hidden wound the community refused to dress. Each obstacle, fear of violence, lack of evidence, the weight of social silence, stacked higher, creating a wall that kept justice out and despair in. The result was a chilling stalemate. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one dared to be the first to say it aloud. And so, the secret lived on, festering behind closed doors, protected by fear, silence, and the cowboy's unyielding control. The turning point came slowly, almost cautiously, as though the truth itself was afraid to step into the light. It began with whispers, then with the courage of a few who could no longer carry the weight of silence. One of the first testimonies came from a former ranch hand who had worked the property in his youth. Years later, after moving to another county, he told a preacher that he had seen things he could never forget. He recalled how the young girl, then still a teenager, was kept close to the cowboy at all times, never allowed to wander far. He noticed bruises on her arms, the kind that could not be explained by farm labor alone. When he once asked about them, the cowboy fixed him with such a cold stare that he never dared raise the subject again. His story was met with disbelief at first, but it planted seeds in minds already filled with suspicion. Then came the medical records. A traveling physician, one of the few who had been admitted to the home, had scribbled private notes after examining 2 of the children. Though he never filed them officially, years later those notes resurfaced. Children of one household, features unusual, repetitive defects, cause uncertain, suspect hereditary. The language was clinical, restrained, but between the lines was the suggestion of something more disturbing, traits passed down too closely within a bloodline. A breakthrough also arrived through the church. A midwife, once called to the house during a difficult birth, finally spoke of what she had witnessed. She told how the cowboy himself had stood outside the room, demanding updates, while the young woman labored in silence. The midwife swore that when she tried to record the father's name in her notes, the girl shook her head, tears filling her eyes, and whispered, "There is no father." The midwife, fearing retribution, kept the story to herself for decades. But as the rumors grew, she confided in her pastor, who passed it along discreetly. Pieces of paper, fragments of testimony, quiet confessions, they began to form a mosaic of evidence too heavy to ignore. Neighbors compared notes and realized that none of the children had ever been baptized publicly, an unusual fact in a community where church rituals marked every stage of life. Census records showed the same gaps again and again: missing fathers, inconsistent ages, unexplained absences. The strongest testimony, however, came from the children themselves. As they grew older, some began to speak in halting words of what life in the ranch had been. Their accounts were fractured, unclear, but enough to paint a picture of fear and control. One boy told a neighbor, "Grandpa is my pa," a phrase dismissed as childish confusion at the time. In retrospect, it became a chilling confirmation of everything the town had feared. By then, the whispers were no longer whispers. They were heavy words spoken in hushed voices, moving from house to house, church to church. The evidence was no longer scattered. It was converging, and it pointed in one direction only. The moment of truth came like a thunderclap, sudden, irreversible, and impossible to silence. For years, the whispers and fragments of evidence had been brushed aside, hidden under fear and denial. But in 1888, circumstances forced the secret into the open, and the community of Deadwood could no longer look away. It began with a schoolteacher. One of the older children, finally old enough to attend classes in town, struggled to keep up with lessons. The boy carried the same familiar features as the cowboy, so much so that other children teased him, calling him Little John, after the old man's given name. When the teacher asked about his father, the boy hesitated, his face clouding with confusion. Then, in a voice too soft to be playful, he said, "Pa is Grandpa." The word sent a chill through the classroom. The teacher dismissed the class early and carried the story to the pastor, who urged her to remain quiet until more could be learned. But the damage was done. The phrase began to ripple through town like wildfire. Soon after, a confrontation erupted. The sheriff, pressed by townsfolk who demanded answers, rode to the ranch with 2 deputies. There they found the young woman, no longer a child, yet still under the shadow of her grandfather, holding a newborn in her arms. When asked the child's father's name, she broke. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered the words she had carried in silence for years. "It's him! It's always been him!" Her voice trembled, but the confession was clear. The cowboy denied it, his face hard as stone. He cursed the neighbors, cursed the sheriff, swore that outsiders had no right to meddle in his household. But the testimonies, the documents, the physical evidence of the children themselves, all of it stood against him. No denial could erase the unmistakable truth written on the children's faces, nor could his anger silence the granddaughter's broken confession. For the first time, the walls of silence cracked wide open. What had been a rumor now stood as fact. The cowboy had fathered children with his own granddaughter, generation folding into generation, leaving behind a line marked by suffering, shame, and deformity. The revelation was not met with relief, but with horror. Neighbors who had once excused their silence felt the weight of guilt. Mothers held their children closer, fathers muttered in anger, and the church bells rang not for celebration, but for mourning. It was the kind of truth that changed the way people looked at each other, a stain on the town's history that could never be washed away. Deadwood had seen violence, greed, and sin in many forms, but nothing compared to this. This was not the lawlessness of outlaws or the desperation of poverty. This was something deeper, darker, a betrayal of family, of trust, of humanity itself. And now it was out in the open for all to see. The revelation struck Deadwood like a hammer, splitting the town into those who demanded justice and those who muttered that family matters should remain private. But once the granddaughter's confession was spoken aloud, there was no way to put it back into silence. The sheriff, though hesitant, had no choice but to act. The cowboy was arrested, his wrists bound in iron cuffs, and taken into town on horseback. The image of the once powerful rancher, now chained like a common criminal, was burned into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. The trial was swift, though not without controversy. The courtroom filled with townsfolk, miners with dust still clinging to their clothes, ranch wives clutching shawls tight around their shoulders, even children who had snuck in despite warning. The atmosphere was tense, every whisper carrying the weight of scandal. Testimonies were given. The teacher repeated the child's words, the midwife recounted her memory of a birth with no father's name, and the ranch hand spoke of the bruises he had seen years before. Each account chipped away at the cowboy's denial, exposing a pattern of abuse too consistent to dismiss. The defense argued the girl had invented the story under pressure, that neighbors exaggerated their tales, that deformities in the children were the result of poor health, not bloodlines. But when the granddaughter herself took the stand, her voice low but unwavering, the courtroom fell silent. She described years of captivity, of threats, of silence enforced not by choice but by fear. Each word cut through the room like a blade. The verdict was inevitable: guilty. The cowboy was sentenced to years in prison, though some argued it was too light a punishment for the harm he had caused. In those days, the law had no clear precedent for crimes like his. Incest was a word whispered but rarely prosecuted, and many legal codes considered it a private matter unless undeniable evidence forced intervention. What was undeniable now was that the law had failed for too long, and only the courage of a broken young woman and her children had brought the truth forward. The consequences rippled far beyond the courtroom. The community, once silent, was now burdened with shame. Neighbors who had turned away, afraid to act, carried guilt for their silence. Preachers thundered from pulpits about sin and corruption, though many in town whispered that they too had ignored warning signs for years. Some families even left Deadwood altogether, unwilling to live in a place stained by such scandal. For the children, the judgment brought little comfort. They were left marked not only by their bloodline, but also by the cruel whispers of other children and the heavy stares of adults. They were victims twice over, first of their grandfather's crimes, then of a society that struggled to decide whether to pity or condemn them. And so, the trial did not end the suffering. It only made the hidden wound visible, forcing Deadwood to confront the cost of its silence and the fragility of its justice. After the trial, life in Deadwood moved forward on the surface, but beneath it, the scars of the scandal never fully healed. The cowboy was taken away to prison, his ranch abandoned and left to decay under the weight of its own history. The once busy yard grew silent, weeds climbing the fences, boards loosening on the house, until it became a ghost of what it once was, a physical reminder of the darkness that had thrived there. For the granddaughter, freedom came at a high cost. Though she was no longer under her grandfather's control, she carried the burden of what had been forced upon her. Some townsfolk treated her with sympathy, offering food and clothing, but others whispered behind her back, blaming her for not speaking sooner, as though silence under fear was a choice. Her children bore an even heavier weight. Growing up, they were marked not only by their visible differences, but also by the knowledge of where they came from. Every glance, every murmur in the streets reminded them of a story they never asked to be part of. With time, some of the children were sent to live with distant relatives in other towns, an attempt to give them a chance away from the shadow of Deadwood. A few managed to build quiet lives, but others never escaped the stigma, carrying it until their last days. The tragedy of their bloodline became a story passed from one generation to the next, whispered as a cautionary tale in the Dakotas long after the names themselves had faded from memory. In the years that followed, this case stirred uncomfortable conversations. Local pastors spoke more openly about abuse within families, urging vigilance where silence had once reigned. The law, too, slowly adapted, recognizing that crimes hidden behind closed doors could be just as destructive as those committed in the open streets. Though change came slowly, the story of Deadwood became an example of how communities must act, not look away when something feels wrong. Looking back now, more than a century later, the lesson remains. Isolation can breed darkness when secrets are allowed to fester. Fear can silence voices that desperately need to be heard. And when a community chooses not to see, the cost is borne by the most innocent. The story of the cowboy and his granddaughter is not just about one man's crimes. It is about the danger of silence, the fragility of justice, and the responsibility we all share to protect those who cannot protect themselves. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, how many other secrets have been buried by fear, by shame, or by indifference? And more importantly, what would you do if you saw the signs today?